I remember the night before everything changed like a punchline I didn't understand yet, standing ankle-deep in sawdust under the halogen lights of my shop, while a thumbnail photo of a backyard barbecue flickered on my phone, sent by my mother with a stupid heart emoji that didn't belong. The message was ordinary, the noise of the shop ordinary, but the space felt like a living thing then, breathing slow and steady around me, and I already knew this room was about to be the center of every argument I would ever have with my family. I could smell the cedar I had milled that morning, the sharp tang of metal filings, the oil and varnish that had soaked into the rags like memory. I had spent every slow paycheck and every anxious night building this place. Every nail, every cut, every late invoice stitched me to it. People called it a workshop, but I called it future. I started building this workshop because I could not stomach the idea of working someone else's plan. I was a designer, which meant I saw possibility in raw things, wood with a grain like a fingerprint, steel that could be coaxed into a curve, a drawer that would close so soft it felt like a secret. I saved tips for 2 years waiting on tables, sold a car I loved, and took a small loan that made my stomach cold. I wired the lights myself at 3 in the morning after a shift at the restaurant, and the first time I fired up the vintage table so I felt something like prayer. I named the benches and the machines the way some people name guitars. I sketched a product line on the back of receipts, planned a launch, imagined a tiny storefront with a neon sign and a bar where clients could watch me build right in front of them, sipping coffee while I carved a chair. My plan was ridiculous and precise at the same time. Bespoke furniture for small apartments, a brand that said you could live beautifully in less. I had mock-ups, a website half-built, 3 local orders, and a commission from a cafe that had twice asked me to show them samples. In that workshop, I was not the son who missed family dinners or the sibling who never hugged enough. I was precise, good with math and finish and negotiating with suppliers. I could spend an afternoon teaching a kid to sand and leave him believing he had made something real for the first time. I would close the doors at night, sit on a crate and edit invoices until the moon left, picturing an account of recurring customers, of travel to a design fair where my pieces sat under bright lights and someone with a magazine camera liked a photo enough to print it. My dreams were small in the sense that they fit into a rented warehouse, but they were enormous to me because they were mine. To take away the workshop would not be like taking away furniture. It would be like ripping out the memory center of who I planned to become. My family saw a garage full of clutter and a kid being sentimental. They did not see the business plan stapled into 3-ring binders or the tax forms that proved I was serious. They did not see the late nights or the way I saved by eating the same sandwich for a week. My father, practical to the bone, would stand in the doorway and say things like, "You need a real job," or "Why would you waste your life on making chairs when you can make a guarantee at a bank?" My mother would pat my cheek like I was a child with a paper crown and say it was just a hobby whenever I brought up cash flow. My sister walked through once, waved at a workbench and said, "It's cute, but aren't you over it yet?" The worst was the quiet dismissal, the way they would bring up my brother's name like a mantra, like a shield they were polishing. My brother Sam was what they called the golden child, the kind of person who could snap his fingers and have the whole dining room rearrange itself. He was an expert at looking broke on purpose and at asking for last-minute cash to chase something new and bright. Sam left home when he was 20 with a duffel bag and a vow to find himself that dragged along a series of bad apartments and better stories. He returned every other year with a new plan and an ache for money to fund it. There was the film project that needed finishing, the pop-up restaurant that required a security deposit, the motorcycle he swore would change his life if only he could fix it. For reasons I never could understand, my parents treated him like a calamity they had to appease, like sparing him any hardship would somehow fix whatever charm had failed him. When he came back, he lounged on my mom's couch and said, "I'm starving," and my mother fed him and promised him a loan. She would squeeze my father's hand and say, "He's just going through a phase," and their faces softened like wax. I learned early on not to mention the shop at family dinners because any mention became a contest. If I talked about a new jig I had made, my mother would wave it off and steer the conversation to Sam's upcoming trip. If I mentioned a payment that was late, my father would say we were all pulling through and everyone had to make sacrifices. Sacrifices for what, I wondered, when none of those sacrifices ever involved lending a hand to help me grow. If you listen carefully at family gatherings, you can almost hear the math they do in their heads, carving the pie into slices that always left mine smaller. They loved me in practical measures. They mailed me boxes at Christmas, they hummed at photos of my younger self. But they loved Sam in a way that excused nonsense and leaned into delusion, a kind of blind, expensive optimism. When I stood in my shop that night, I knew this uneven love was a problem, a slow leak in a boat I was building. I did not yet know who would be responsible for the whole. I did not know if the leak would come labeled as sacrifice or necessity. What I did know was that every board, every bolt, every plan pinned to the plywood wall meant something more than a table or a treadmill of work. It meant a future I could touch. And if the future had a cost, I had already paid for most of it with sweat. When I pushed open the workshop door that afternoon, the sound that should have greeted me was missing. There was no metallic chorus of spinning blades, no smell of fresh-cut cedar or oil. The only sound was the cheap tick of the streetlight outside and my own heartbeat, sudden and loud. For a second I thought maybe I had the wrong day, that the orders on my whiteboard had been rescheduled, that I was walking into someone else's silence. Then my feet hit bare concrete where my workbench had been, and the world tilted. The bench had been my spine. I built it from reclaimed beams, milled them down until the grain felt like a face I knew, cut out a shallow groove where my initials lived under a coat of varnish. The bench was gone. In its place, scuff marks on the floor, sawdust swept into 3 sad lines, and a single scrap of paper taped to the wall where my schedule used to hang. The handwriting was my mother's, big, rounded, as if she were still trying to teach someone to write properly. It read, "We sold the equipment to cover Sam's emergency. Sorry, love, Mom." Sorry, the word fell across me like a slab. I walked the shop like someone picking over a crime scene. Drawers that used to cradle chisels, routers, plane irons were bare. My vintage planer, the one I'd spent months restoring and had told everyone was a pain in the ass but worth it for the smooth finish it gave, was gone. My table saw was gone. The stack of walnut I had been saving for that first small collection, the boards I would make a prototype coffee table from, gone. A single cardboard box sat on the cleared floor, taped shut, labeled Sam's emergency with a Sharpie, and nothing inside it but a receipt from a pawn shop and a thin envelope of crumpled bills. I had to sit down. My hands shook so badly I couldn't pull up my phone without dropping it. I called my mother and she picked up in 2 rings, voice warm like nothing had happened. I asked where everything was and she inhaled as if she needed to ration her breath and said, "We sold a few things, it's fine." There was an easy calm to her voice that should have been comforting, and instead it felt like a blade. "Tell me what you sold," I said. She told me they sold the big machines and a few tools to a guy from 2 streets over. "You never used half of it," she said. "It was just junk." Sam needed help and it was an emergency. Sam needed help. I could hear the practice pause that comes before a plea. He had called earlier, third voice layered with panic and bravado both, asking for money to fix a problem he had sprinted into without looking. The problem, as I was later to learn, was that he had boasted to some people he could front a bar pop-up the next day without a permit and without paying his suppliers. He'd tried to buy cheap meat from a guy who disappeared with his deposit. He'd borrowed from the wrong people and promised investors an opening they had no rights to expect. It was, in every sense, a preventable, stupid mess, the sort of thing I had begged them not to enable over and over. But Sam's mouth made a problem into an emergency, and our family turned into a fire brigade. When I asked my father why they had reached for my shop, he was blunt and bafflingly calm. "The machines were movable," he said. "They were easy money compared to selling the house or borrowing from the bank. We had to protect the family. Besides, you never used everything," he added like a verdict. "You had plans, sure, but what do you have right now that pays rent?" It sounded rehearsed, the same words he had used when I was a kid for punishment and later for my practical education. My heart throbbed uneasily. We had had conversations before. I'd shown them spreadsheets, orders, clients. Maybe my fault was that I loved the work more than I hammered it into something they would respect. When I demanded proof, my mother handed me a ledger. The sale was listed in 2 lines with the buyer's name circled. My father was proud of the easy number they had made, the way they had exchanged physical things for immediate cash like a bandage over a belly wound. They had taken the plan that I had been sewing together with late shifts and small victories and cut it off. In their math, the sum of my instruments equaled a balance sheet line item ready to be converted into comfort for someone else. My brother, who had been sitting on the couch with a brand new jacket and a grin that suggested he believed in miracles, shrugged and put his feet up. He said thank you in a tone that made it sound as if he had done something noble. The worst part was the conversation that came afterward, the gaslighting that felt surgical in its cruelty. My sister, arms folded, told me I was being dramatic. "It was an old joke," she said. "You always loved building things but never finished." My mother squeezed my hand and said it had been a family decision, as if 3 people sitting around a kitchen table somehow erased the years of me building, as if their united nod replaced every midnight I had spent sanding. "You can always rebuild," they said, almost gleeful with the possibility of moral superiority. They minimized every piece, every replacement part, as if I were grieving a shed and not the place where I kept the map for the life I had sketched. There is a look in a parent's eyes I recognize now, the one that says they have done right by their child even as they have destroyed him. My mother wore that look with the same flush she had worn at my high school graduation, like a badge. My father had never looked prouder. Sam kept his head down like a man who knew he had been granted an undeserved pardon. That moment when they told me it was necessary, that it was for the family, felt like a verdict that had already been written. For my family, the emergency had a face and a story, and my shop was only a thing you could trade. For me, it was everything I had. I left the house with a resistor in my pocket, a stub of a receipt, and an anger that tasted like salt and old coffee. I walked to the pawn shop named on the slip and saw my planer sitting where the owner thought it was just a valuable old machine. He had bought it, of course, and could not have cared less about the initials beneath its paint. He treated my memory like a merged asset and handed me a number I would not live to make back. I understood in that split second why people burn bridges with fire. Because sometimes the only way to keep warm is to take what is left and make something new with the ashes. They gathered in the kitchen like a jury, sunlight slicing through the blinds and drawing lines across the table where we would decide my future without me. My mother had folded her hands as if in prayer, my father sat with a newspaper he wasn't reading, and Sam leaned back with an expression that looked like gratitude and entitlement mixed into one. My sister perched on the counter with an air of someone who had already written the verdict. When I walked in with the pawn shop receipt in my pocket and the planer's initials still fresh in my head, their faces tightened into the practiced calm of people who believed they had done right. My first words were simple, practical, the ones I thought would anchor them to reality. Why did you sell my machines without asking me? I showed them the receipt, the buyer's name circled in felt tip, the amount that was a fraction of what I'd spent. I explained the orders that were now impossible to complete, the cafe deposit I had to return, the mock-ups on my laptop that were worthless without a workshop. I expected a pause, or at least an apology that tasted faintly of embarrassment. Instead, they offered me a lesson. My father's voice was flat, the kind of voice he uses when smoothing over an accident with a shrug. We had to choose, he said. The rent on Sam's space, the deposits, the men who were calling and not asking for patience. If we had left it, we would have lost more. He told the story like a man reading from a ledger, as if the shop was not a spine but a column on a balance sheet that could be shaved down for liquidity. My mother took over, her tone that of someone who has rehearsed sacrifice. She said things like, we saved him, and it was necessary, and you were always so into that stuff anyway. She smiled at me with the same softness she gave a child when convincing him vegetables were candy. They used words that were designed to sting less and sting more. You can rebuild, they said, and acted as if those 6 words could repair the months of work, the orders canceled, the clients I had lost. You never used half of it, they said, as if the months of grinding in a cold space counted for nothing because the physical objects were gone. My sister, who had once complimented a bookshelf I made and then forgotten it the next week, chimed in that we had to think about the family, about stability. Sam added, almost parenthetical, that I needed to grow up and let go of pointless projects. Their logic was comfortable because it required nothing of them but the ability to name sacrifice and walk away from its consequences. When I tried to point out the difference between tools and a life plan, they brushed it off like a child objecting to bedtime. Life isn't a game of what-ifs, my father said. We made a call. Sam was in immediate trouble. He would have burned through more credit, dragged us into debt, maybe even ruined the house if we'd waited. They painted a horror that hinged on my immediate compliance. Creditors at the door, a foreclosure notice pinned to their front step, a son sleeping on the street. I could see they had practiced this narrative until it fit like a glove. They assumed acceptance from me as the default response, as if my gratitude for being excluded was the only moral posture available. But the guilt they tried to hang on me backfired. I wasn't being dramatic, I was being erased. The phrase that cut deepest was not the bargaining or the threats, but the casual way they minimized my work. It was a hobby, my mother said, like they were talking about stamp collecting or knitting. You were never going to make it big, my sister added, like final judgment rather than concern. I had been the one to put my credit score on the line, to sell my car, to work nights until I couldn't feel the soles of my feet, and they reduced it to weekend fun. Their eyes did not reflect regret. They reflected the certainty of people who know they have done the right thing and have already moved on to plan the party for the good deed. I asked them to see my spreadsheets, to read the emails from clients, to understand that this was not a midlife whim but a future I had been paying with my life. They shuffled the papers like wallpaper and directed me back to the family. You never thought about us, my mother said, implying that my refusal to tuck my dream into a neat, serviceable box that fits the household was selfish. My father told me he had waved down a buyer and made a sale in 15 minutes flat, like a man telling a story about catching fish. Sam patted my shoulder with the casual disdain of a man who knows he has been gifted forgiveness. When I screamed, it came out a single raw sound, not directed at one person but at the entire calculus that had reduced a living room full of tools to numerical absolution. They heard me and labeled me unstable. They told me to calm down, as if sanity and my ability to hold a plan were the same thing. They told me to be reasonable and grateful. The look in their faces when they said it was the same look people wear when they measure the worth of an idea and find it lacking. They were not asking for my understanding, they were demanding my silence. That night I packed nothing but a backpack. I left the house with the echo of their voices in my head, the excuse that it had been an emergency and the demand that I understand. Outside, the air felt thin and loud. I walked until the streetlights bled into the early dark, until the city swallowed my footprints. I did not cry. The feeling was less like grief and more like a line being drawn under a paragraph in my life. This was the final straw because it was more than theft. It was a lesson that I was optional. I realized they would never see the work the same way I did, and that realization burned clearer than any anger. They thought they had saved a son. What they had done, unknowingly, was give me a reason to stop asking permission. I left with a single backpack and a knot in my throat that felt like unpaid rent. I walked out while my family argued about paint colors and who would drop Sam at the airport, and I did not look back. I left the house the way a witness leaves the scene of a crime, careful not to touch anything, cataloging every word and face I could. I turned off my phone and then turned it back on just long enough to block my parents, my sister, and Sam. It was a small, lawless taste of control. I was done explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was worth. That first night I slept in a friend's spare room, the mattress a rumpled island smelling faintly of laundry detergent and old coffee. The next week I moved into a room above a laundromat and paid rent in cash from tips I scraped working afternoons delivering food. I could afford a cheap space with no heat that rattled in winter and a window that looked out over a parking lot. It was humiliating in the practical ways. No workbench, no table saw, no reclaimed walnut neatly stacked and waiting. But there was a raw honesty to it I preferred to the polite betrayal inside my parents' house. I did not answer their calls. When texts came in calling me dramatic or selfish or asking if I was okay, I read them and let the anger boil into a clarity that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with me. I had little money, but I had hands and a discipline forged by years of late nights. The first reality to accept was that I could no longer build big things. The second was that most of my skill was portable, measuring, joint-making, finishing, the way I could coax a curve from something stubborn. I took to the streets with a cheap set of chisels, a block plane, and a cordless drill I borrowed from a neighbor. I scavenged wood from dumpster piles behind closed-down cafes, smelling a richer grain under the rot. I traded labor at a tiny bike repair shop for the use of a corner and a couple of clamps. It was not the workshop I had loved, but it was a space where something might begin again. The idea came to me in pieces and then in a rush, like water finding a new channel after a dam breaks. I realized I could build smaller, smarter, and sell directly to people who lived in small apartments and wanted beautiful things that did not scream expensive. Instead of a heavy, bespoke table, I could design a modular shelf system that fit into doorways, a line of compact accent pieces that folded flat and shipped in a box. The constraint that had felt like punishment was suddenly a design advantage. I started sketching on napkins in cafes, pinning dimensions to the margins of receipts. I called an old client, the cafe that had given me the commission months earlier, and offered to make a counter display of spice racks for half the usual price if they let me finish in their back room. They said yes, probably because small cafes are desperate for personality, but also because they had liked what I made before. The first piece I sold was almost a miracle. I posted a photo taken with my phone on a local marketplace, a simple shelf made from a salvaged plank with a live edge and a hidden bracket I had jigged from scrap metal. I wrote the description like it was a short confession, hand-built, made from reclaimed materials, locally finished. Someone bought it that afternoon. The money was tiny, but the feeling of exchange was enormous. A person I had never met had seen value in my work without my family's permission. The sale paid for a spool of finish and a handful of screws, and more importantly, it validated a plan I had sketched on the back of a receipt. Night after night I worked until my hands ached and my body felt like a machine that had been recalibrated for different rhythms. I lived by a brutal schedule, deliveries in the afternoon, building in the evenings, photography and listings at 2 in the morning. Anger was my fuel and ambition my compass. I was no longer trying to prove something to my family so much as proving to myself that I was not finished. I wrote down costs, margins, and a small ad budget I could afford to test. I learned to edit photos to make textures sing and to write descriptions that told the story behind each small piece. People began to notice the neatness of my joints and the story of the materials. I started to get repeat buyers who recommended me to friends. The humility of those first months taught me an important and bitter truth: they had not taken everything. They had taken objects but not the craft, the capacity to adapt, or the relationships I could still build. I learned to market a lifestyle instead of mansion furniture, a life where well-made things were modest and intimate instead of grand and expensive. The new plan felt larger than the workshop ever had because it solved a problem I had not admitted I was solving: the need for honest, small-scale objects that fit the way most people live now. Each small sale rewired the idea a little further from revenge toward construction. I imagined a brand, a modest storefront run leanly and honestly, a place where customers could sit and watch me make. It was not the neon sign I had dreamt of. It was more cunning, more stubborn, and it could be taken on the road. When I lay awake some nights, I pictured my family at dinner, laughing about the sale like they had given away an old coat. That image, once a raw wound, began to harden into something cold and useful. I did not need to watch them burn. I only needed to build a life so resilient they could not smother it with a few careless decisions. The ashes of my old shop were not an end, but the ground where something else could grow. And under the streetlight above the laundromat, I started to sketch the first real blueprint of my comeback. They thought I had left with my dreams in pieces, like a man who had been emptied out. At family barbecues, they told guests I was staying with a friend and trying to find my feet. My mother texted relatives that I was being dramatic and needed time. Nobody guessed that the nights I had thought would be for crying were being poured into plans instead. I kept my silence like a weapon. While they swapped stories of my downfall over coffee, I was making lists by the light of a laundromat sign, mapping out a way to turn the damage into the raw material of something new. First, I stopped pretending the past had to be replicated. The old workshop had been a cathedral to tools and heavy machines, and that approach had made the loss devastating. I embraced smallness. I began designing pieces that required intelligence more than space: fold-away tables that doubled as art, wall-mounted desks that fit into closet depths, compact chairs that nested together. The trick was to make something that felt like it belonged in a magazine yet fit inside the back of a hatchback. I sketched until my pencil stung, then I built prototypes from scavenged wood under the neon laundromat light. Every mistake taught me a shortcut, and every shortcut became part of a system. Money was the old enemy, so I turned scarcity into strategy. I used the pawn receipt as a ledger of small losses and traded that bitterness for bargaining chips. I began doing odd jobs for local creatives: set dressing for film students, props for photographers, tiny stages for buskers. My pieces lent atmosphere inexpensively, and the people who worked in those worlds had audiences. Instead of asking for money, I traded shelves for credits in film projects and for a few shots of my work in the backgrounds of student reels. Those images looked like lifestyle magazine stills when shot well, and they gave me the visuals I could use online without expensive photo shoots. I built a mobile showroom out of a beat-up van I bought from a guy who needed cash right then, and I converted the bed into a display. It smelled like old oil and possibilities, and at night I slept in the passenger seat with plans spread across my knees. The van let me bring furniture to people instead of waiting for stores to notice me. I rolled to block parties, to open houses, to the parking lots of cafes that liked the idea of rotating decor. I called it guerrilla retail. I left a tiny shelf propped inside a cafe next to a stack of menus with a small card that read handmade, local, edge and grain, and a QR code. People began taking photos of that shelf because it looked honest on the screen. A blogger posted a picture with the caption "Found beautiful things in unfinished places," and after that a local reporter called. The reporter's piece was a tiny spark. Orders trickled in. A freelance editor wanted a wall desk for his cramped apartment, a tattoo artist commissioned a foldable bench for his studio, and a boutique hotel asked for a test run of bedside shelves that could bolt without holes. Each order paid for the next set of materials. I reinvested ruthlessly, never taking more than a sliver for myself. The secret was not to be everything at once, but to make a handful of people deliriously happy. Those clients turned into messengers, posting photos of my pieces in their lives and tagging me. The social proof looked nothing like my parents' ledger and everything like proof that someone cared about the work. I also learned to exploit systems the way you exploit a hole in a fence. I listed a project on a crowdfunding platform as a limited run, not for funding but for market validation and pre-orders. I posted a rough behind-the-scenes video of me making a single joint, showing the small magic of it. People responded like they had been waiting for a craftsman they could trust. Within a month, I had pre-orders that covered a lease deposit for a tiny shared workshop and enough to buy a used planing machine from the same pawn shop that had once sold mine. I bought it, greased it, and named the first piece I made on it the comeback. It felt stupid and glorious to weld together something from the ashes and call it a promise. There were nastier little plays too. I studied where Sam's friends and casual acquaintances lived, where they posted their parties and clients and left tasteful pieces in places they frequented. It wasn't revenge, it was strategy. A lamp I had made ended up in the background of a video where Sam's friend bragged about events. Someone asked where the lamp was from, and the comment thread branched into someone asking for a living room bench. Words splintered in directions my family could not imagine. They assumed my silence equaled ruin because ruin was comfortable for them. I used their assumption like a blind spot. I started teaching small workshops in borrowed spaces, 4 people max, hands-on, cheap, with the promise of walking away with something they made themselves. Those classes sold out. People brought friends and friends became customers. The glowing part of the plan was that every student was also a living billboard. When they posted pictures of their first shelf with the caption, "I made this with a man who changed my life," the ripple effect was more valuable than any nice review. My business grew without a storefront and without my parents needing to be right. By the time they stopped asking about me in conversations, I had orders stacked 3 weeks out, a small team of 2 other makers who trusted me, and a product line that fit into a single delivery truck. I had a brand no one in my family had invested in emotionally, and that made it harder for them to dismiss. They believed they had starved me into collapse, but what they didn't understand was that hunger sharpens focus. My ascent was quiet, not because it was small, but because I needed to build without their interference. I wasn't rebuilding the old cathedral, I was building a network of small altars, and each one burned a little brighter than the last. The silence they enjoyed was a mistake. In that silence, I learned to whisper in a voice the city could not ignore. I was supposed to be invisible when it happened, which made the moment feel like a knife turned clean and public. I had been waking at dawn, cutting and sanding in a borrowed corner of the shared workshop, when my phone lit up with messages that began as ordinary orders and turned into 1,000 small fireworks. A blogger I had traded a shelf with months ago had posted a photo of one of my fold-away desks in an apartment tour, and someone with a big account reshared it with a one-line that read "Genius for City Living." By noon, the post had 200,000 views, and my name was threaded through hundreds of comments. I poured myself another coffee, and my hand shook in a way that felt like the first honest tremor since the shop was sold. The world I had been building quietly was suddenly under a spotlight, so bright it burned the edges of the past. The first big piece of public success came not as a check or a guaranteed contract, but as an invitation. A design festival in the city had seen the post, followed the trail to my van photos and student reel placements, and offered me a small slot on a showcase stage. I thought it was a joke at first, the kind of official nothing that happens when a festival wants to appear inclusive without risking anything. But the curator emailed again, then called, and the tone changed. They loved the modular logic, they said, and they wanted a live demonstration. I had less than 2 weeks to prepare. People who thought I was broken and flatlined assumed I would miss it, which made the whole thing feel like an inside joke I was going to win. I built the centerpiece in one furious week. I took a reclaimed beam someone had left behind at a renovation site and split it down until the grain sang. I used the planing machine I had bought back from the pawn shop and swore at it with gratitude while the motor sputtered like a sleeping dog waking up. The object that came out of those nights was not a cathedral table but a compact system that folded into a suitcase, expanded into 10 different configurations, and packed down into a neat trunk for people who moved every few years. I called it the Nest because it felt like making room for life. On the day of the festival, I loaded it into the van and drove through a city that had no patience for small stories, wondering if anyone would notice the difference between a story sold and a life rebuilt. They noticed. The showcase hall was full of curated noise, but people stopped at my little corner. I demonstrated the Nest to a cluster of editors, influencers, and 2 very serious judges. One of the judges sat down and closed her eyes like she was listening, and when she folded the piece out, she laughed out loud in a way that made my chest soft. My demo video, simple, hands-on, went on the festival stream. By the time the awards were announced, I was not confident, just drained. But when they called my name and I walked to the stage under a swarm of lights, my body moved with an old muscle memory of craft rather than theatrics. The applause was huge in a concrete sort of way, and when I delivered my short speech I said, plain and cold, "Thank you." I meant the crowd, but also the small burning that had turned into heat hot enough to do work. What made the moment explosive was not the trophy itself, but the piece the festival produced about me afterward. A journalist had filmed the build, interviewed a few of the people who had traded favors with me, and included before and after shots that cut like a film splice. She used one of the student reels to show where the first photos came from, and like a kind of soft forensic reconstruction, traced the path back to my old workshop and the pawn shop receipt I had once carried like an albatross. The article did more than praise my design. It told a story about what had been taken away and what had been built back. It included a clip of the pawn shop owner admitting he had sold a planer and a table saw months earlier without knowing the story attached to them. It included a quieter, sharper line about a family who had chosen the small, immediate fix over a son's future. The story went viral in a way that made their kitchen conversations look like gossip in the wrong century. My phone filled with interview requests. A morning show invited me to bring the nest on live television. Small boutiques called asking for a first run. The crowdfunding campaign I had used for validation turned into pre-orders that would keep my small team paid for months. The number of people who had once thought I was ruined called, emailed, and invited me to collaborate. The scale was not overnight wealth. It was legitimacy shoved into my hands with a force I had not expected. Meanwhile, the image of my mother and father watching the morning show unfolded in my head like a scene in someone else's life. I imagined them freezing at the moment where the journalist mentioned the pawn receipt, the line that named what they thought was private. I imagined Sam's face folding in real time as strangers applauded a life choice he had been soothed into causing. The calls started that evening, at first from relatives who assumed I would want to gloat, then from my mother who left a voicemail that was a jumble of sympathy and careful defensiveness. I listened to them like I had learned to measure wood tight, then releasing, and I did not call back. They could watch the video of me explaining my work and decide what it meant and why it mattered. What I had not expected was how the public revelation made their small, private calculus brittle and obvious. There was a delicious irony in headlines that named me as the craftsman behind the city's trick of making small spaces feel lived in. The very dream they sold off to pay for a night of Sam's reckless promises had become a public symbol and a profitable product. The people applauding were people who wanted what I had made. And too late the ones who had traded my tools for quick comfort realized they had mortgage papers and an apology that could not buy back the momentum they had thrown away. The city that had once ignored me now put the work on its stage, and in that public light my life was not a hobby to be minimized. It was a business born of stubbornness and the kind of talent that does not disappear when a room is emptied. The first call came at noon, a voice I had not heard in months that sounded like it belonged to someone sprinting. It was my father, and the noise in the background was not the careful quiet of his usual composure but something like a storm, a woman shouting, a phone slamming, footsteps. He said the suppliers were at the door and he couldn't make them go away. He said the men at the restaurant were calling every hour and wanted their money, that Sam had promised large checks and now the ledgers were red, and that the people who had lent him the money wanted answers. There was a kind of flat panic to his voice I had never heard before, the kind that shreds the practiced calm and leaves you holding the bare facts. I could hear the neighbors talking in the background like wolves circling. My first reaction was a small, private satisfaction that felt like bending a blade against a file. They had used my tools like spare change once. Now someone else wanted to take change from them. I felt the urge to gloat at the cosmic neatness of it, to deliver a line that would sting. But then the deeper thing came, the way someone's life unspooled when decisions you had not made were made on your behalf. There was a human cost even to poetic justice, and the sight of their scramble annoyed and shamed me in equal measure. The truth was uglier than I imagined. Sam's little scheme had not been a single night of mismanagement, but a house of cards built of borrowed inventory, unpaid contractors, and false promises. The suppliers, meat purveyors, lighting renters, a small mobile bar company, had all been contracted under leases Sam had no right to sign. When they realized funds had been moved around and some had been redirected to pay down credit card debts and emergencies, they started calling the guarantors, the people whose names were on the rental agreements and the deposit checks. My parents' names were on a lot of paperwork because Sam had a talent for persuading with a combination of charisma and familial pressure. He had convinced them to cosign or to front deposits on the pretense of being careful. They had been naive and indulgent in equal measure. When creditors start asking questions, they do not care for the shape of love. They care for paper and signatures. The accounts showed transfers back to an account labeled Sam Ventures and then to a credit card used for concert tickets and a short flight to a festival he had bragged about. Suppliers filed complaints. A lawyer texted my father that the hotel who had hosted the pop-up had begun a suit for breach of contract. Another company called seeking repayment and demanded the house as collateral if payment wasn't made within 30 days. When my mother told me this, she said the word house like someone naming a traitor, and I heard the way the kitchen calmed into the hush of people stacking their last chips. Panic made them clumsy. They tried to call the buyer from the pawn shop and ask for a refund or a buyback. They tried to find my planer and the table saw to put everything back the way it had been, thinking that if only they could return the physical pieces, the ledger could be balanced and the mess cleaned up. The pawn shop owner, suddenly wise and expensive, told them the machines had already been resold to a small film studio upstate and then to a prop house downtown. He offered them a number that equaled more money than they now had and less than the damage being claimed by contractors. They begged, they offered, they threatened. It was a theater in which none of the actors had rehearsed. In short order, the small disasters multiplied. A lawyer called my sister to tell her a lien was being placed. The bank called my father and said there was a suspicious fluctuation in accounts. The landlord of the cafe that had taken Sam's deposit threatened to turn over the lease to collections. People they had smoothed over for years were no longer willing to give the benefit of the doubt now that their own books were underwater. Social media, God help me, started to spread the festival article with a new, angrier frame. How a family had sold a son's tools to save another's failing vanity project. Local gossip turned into real-world consequences when the hotel publicly announced it had been misled. An influencer pulled his collaboration and tweeted about contract fraud. Suddenly, Sam's problems were not isolated, they were public, and people with money and lawyers were smelling blood. The moral geometry of it was stunning. In their desire to patch a single hole quickly, my parents had burned the bridge that could have been used to patch the rest. They had sold the thing that allowed me to earn and repay debts, to rebuild in a way that might have lifted the family out of the deeper hole they now found themselves in. When contractors asked for timelines and my mother admitted she had helped pay a deposit with tools she did not understand the value of, the look on their faces was not pity but arithmetic. You cannot sell the goose and then complain when you have no eggs. That old saying settled in the room like frost. They called me in the end, a string of messages that climbed the ladder of desperation. Please come home, we need you, we don't know what to do, your brother's in trouble, we sold things but we'll get them back, you're the only one who can help. They tried every lever they had left, guilt, shame, pleading. The last one, my mother left a voicemail that was half apology, half sob, where she said the words "we sold the machines" as if saying them enough might make them less true. When I listened, alone in my small, rented room with the van running in my head like a background hum, I felt something cold and careful align inside me. I could have returned. I could have took their phone calls, used my new credit to buy back the machines and saved the house. I could have used the trust I had rebuilt with clients to put men on roofs and keep the suppliers at bay. That option tugged at a place in me that had always wanted to be seen as the son who forgives. But the lesson of everything, a brutal, private teaching, was that reparations without accountability are just another mismatch destined to happen again. They had not only taken my tools, they had treated my future like a petty ledger entry. They had assumed kindness and used it like a currency. So I did not answer. I let the calls go to voicemail. I let the lawyer letters pile on their table unread. I watched from the clean distance of someone who had learned to rebuild with his own hands as the consequences tightened around them. The house went up on the market when lenders demanded the equity be freed or else foreclosure proceedings would begin. Sam did what Sam always did. He ran, this time not to a couch but to a quiet place where his name would not carry the same weight, and in doing so left behind liabilities that bore down on my parents like weights. I could imagine the faces of contractors as they drove away with their unpaid invoices and the people who had been promised openings and never saw them. There was no delight in their ruin, only a hardening satisfaction that the moral calculus had finally caught up with the practical one. They had used a life to plug a hole and in doing so had opened a rent larger and colder than before. The realization of what they had thrown away did not come as a single moment of enlightenment but as a slow dawning. A banker's letter, a neighbor's pitying glance, the pawn shop's firm refusal to reverse transactions. They learned that some things cannot be bought back with quick money and that the only currency of real value, the ability to make and to sustain, had been taken from them. I had been right about the workshop. It was not just wood and steel to be pawned off for convenience. It was a capital that could not be restocked overnight. As for me, the silence I kept was not cruelty, it was the boundary I had to draw to keep myself intact. They had created the emergency, they had misread the value of what they sold. Now they watched as a tide they had set in motion turned and exposed the weakness of their own choice. Karma, if you like that word, does not work like a placard you can read and learn from quickly. It rolls. And when it rolled over them, it found the smallest, meanest seam they had used to stitch themselves together, and pulled it open so that the world could finally, painfully see the cost. The first time my phone lit with my mother's name after months of silence, I almost didn't answer. The number on the screen vibrated like a small animal trapped in a jar, and for a second I pictured the kitchen where they had decided my life was expendable. When I did pick up, her voice was thin and edged with a fear I had never heard in it before, the kind that makes even the most practiced excuses sound like confessions. She asked me to come home. She asked me to help. She said the word help so many times it lost meaning, and became something like a plea for someone to rearrange the world back to how it had been. They came to my workshop before I could decide whether to go. My sister arrived first, breathless and carrying a plastic bag with coffee, as if comfort could be bought in a convenience store. My father followed with his shoulders hunched in a way I had only ever seen when he believed something irreparable had been done. My mother stood at the doorway and blinked like someone seeing a stranger. Sam did not show up at first. He had a talent for avoiding accountability and apparently some talent for calling from places he thought were private. When I opened the door and let them step into the light, I watched the way their faces fell across the benches and the hung pieces, looking for a hint that this was a museum and not what I had built out of nights and dirt. They began with the small talk, the practiced breathing of people who had rehearsed tones of genuine sorrow. "We were so wrong," my mother said, voice fragile as paper. "We were desperate," my father said. "We thought it was the only way to stop him," my sister said, as if she had been answering for someone else. Then the pleas came, silent offers to make amends, vague promises that if I helped they would sell the house, they would ask for loans, they would do anything. Their eyes never met mine. They darted toward the tools like magpies trying to read a map on a workbench. I let them talk because I wanted to see how far the guilt could stretch. When they finally stopped, I pulled a small stack of invoices, my spreadsheet printouts, and the crowdfunding tally from a drawer and set them on the table like a surgeon setting out instruments. The room smelled like wood and solvent and something else I could not name that felt like cement dust. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The numbers spoke, and they cut more cleanly than any argument I could have made. I told them in plain language that left no room for sentimentalities, what my business was really worth now: orders scheduled, deposits taken, a small payroll I had to maintain, a lease that obligated me for 12 months. I explained the legal steps I had taken. The brand was trademarked, the production process documented, the inventory insured. I explained how fragile the early success was, how one unpaid wage could undo months of trust. It was not theatrics. It was the voice of someone who had learned the truth about rebuilding from the ground up. The cold truth was that their problem could not be solved by pawning back a few old machines. Even if I wanted to help, which I did not, it would take more than tools to unwind the debts and the broken contracts Sam had signed. They reached for stories then. My father said that we were family, which sounded like an ask more than an argument. My mother wept and said they had been foolish and begged me to come and save them. My sister twisted the corner of a napkin with shaking fingers. My brother finally came in on a half apology, eyes rimmed with something like shame and the kind of charming bewilderment he always had when the world turned against him. Sam told me he had learned his lesson, or that he would pay me back, or that he had been reckless but sincere. It was the same language he used when he wanted another chance, a script that had worked for years in their living room. I told them no. It felt simple to say and terrible to mean. No, I said, I will not bail you out of the mess you chose to create. No, I said, because if I hand you money or tools now you will learn nothing and we will be back to this same table in a year. No, I said, because you treated what I made as disposable when it suited you, and I will not be the safety net for a child you never taught self-reliance to. I watched the faces change through the syllables, their desperation turning to shock and then to a kind of furious bargaining. They offered me everything that had once been beyond negotiation: a share of the house, custody of a car, promises of public apologies. My father even suggested that I could run Sam's remnants for a while if only I would come home and fix what had been broken. Each offer felt like a small bandage over old wounds, a way for them to feel like doers instead of deciders. The thing they could not give back was their decision-making from the past year. They had signed documents, co-signed loans, written checks, and handed them to a son they preferred to believe in. Those were signatures that did not vanish when I said no. I told them I would help in one way only: by refusing to enable the behavior that caused the collapse. I offered no money. I offered no labor. I offered the one thing that could produce change, which was accountability. I said that if they wanted my help in the future, they would come with a plan that showed they understood the costs of what they had done, that Sam would take responsibility in writing, that they would step away from enabling him, and that they would agree to a mediated repayment schedule. They looked at me like I had spoken a foreign language. They pleaded instead. They argued that the house needed saving, that the neighborhood would gossip, that grandchildren might suffer. I left them then with their hands empty and their promises loud. I walked out of the shop and closed the door without looking back, because the last thing I had wanted to be was the person who patched a wound so it could fester. I understood with a cold clarity that sometimes the right thing is to refuse the shortcut that repeats the same mistake. They would have to face the lawyers, the liens, the foreclosure notices, and the public shame their choices had earned. I would not be their emergency exit. When they texts multiplied, pleas, threats, offers of public mea culpas, I read them like someone reading weather reports. I watched a few days later as a neighbor tipped me off that a moving van had come for a few boxes at their house, and I felt no vindictive joy in it. Instead, there was a sense of something settling, like dust finding its level. I had spent months building with less than them, and I had done it without asking anyone to rearrange their lives to suit me. In the weeks that followed, I kept my head down and my schedule full. I had no time for fantasizing about their humiliation. I had clients who trusted me and a small team who had left comfortable lives to follow me into something uncertain. They deserved that safety. I had learned an expensive lesson about borders and worth and the price of being indispensable without being respected. The thing I built was not just a business. It was a life I could stand behind without apology. I never took pleasure in watching them pay the price, but I did take ownership of my refusal. It was not cruelty, it was not grace, it was a boundary. They had chosen the instant fix over long-term capital. They had turned my future into petty cash. When the consequences crashed down on them, they had only themselves to blame. My refusal was not a final punishment, but a clean line in the sand. I would not be the bridge they burned. I would only be the one who walked away and built another.